Hi there, welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud, and it is presented to you here exclusively on the Saltwire Network. And this has been an interesting time to watch a lot of what's happening with police community relations. And there was an event to add Constable Heidi Stevens' name to the fallen officer's monument. It was the 40th such ceremony in Halifax. It took place at Grand Parade. And as we know, she was a victim of the mass killer here in Nova Scotia. And for whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure why, her name was not added last year, so it is on the memorial going forward. You can read more about that at saltwire.com. And there was another story that I caught last week, an opinion piece from Stephen Schneider. Does the thin blue line patch signify thinly veiled bigotry? And I asked that, or he asked that rhetorically, because it was an incident involving RCMP officers more than a week ago, where with this protest or group that was holding this event, they called it a fundraiser, and the police gave a donation, quote unquote, and had posed for pictures. And then this rather odd police news release came out describing what had happened and worry of escalation. Stephen Schneider is a professor of criminology at St. Mary's University, and always enjoy catching up with him for his thoughts. He was the author of that piece. Stephen Schneider, it's nice to see you again, Professor. How are you?
Good, Sheldon. Thanks for having me back.
And just out of a matter of coincidence, Angus Reid has been asking folks about this particular issue. In fact, quite a stark headline from them on their website: concerns over crime climbed to a decade high, and confidence in RCMP plummets below majority. You and I have touched on that issue about, real versus perceived increase in crime and what it means. And I guess to start off, does it surprise you in some ways that less than 50% of the population has some level of comfort or support for the RCMP in this country?
It's a bit unnerving, for sure. I think the broader context for this, first of all, is if you look at polls about Canadians' confidence in other dominant institutions in society, you'll see a similar type of negativity. So everything on the healthcare system, obviously, on education, on Parliament, every poll that comes out that tries to measure the public's perception of how state institutions are operating tend to be negative right now. There's a real malaise in the population. We're living through fairly negative times, and whether wars and inflation and convoy truckers and failing healthcare systems. So that tends to get reflected in polls. But certainly with respect to polls about the criminal justice system or the RCMP in particular, the RCMP has been, plagued with a lot of bad news in the last few years, whether it's a critique of the response to the mass shooter inquiry, the criticism of the inquiry in murder and missing Indigenous women. There is a lot of news about the toxic culture in the RCMP. There's a class action lawsuit launched by female members and civilian members. There's the ongoing debate in municipalities like Surrey whether to replace the RCMP. So a lot of this is driven by the news media and what we see in the news, but also social media as well, which tends to drive our opinions even more than the news media these days, and especially when we live in these sort of bubbles that are constantly algorithmed to feed us negative news. The other thing is it's often, the admiration or respect or approval of police is often tied to not crime rates, but fear of crime. And so we have an aging population, and the older your population gets, the more fearful of crime we become, even though seniors are the least victimized cohort in society. But as we get older, we have the baby boomers now entering the September and winter of their years. And so you see a fear of crime rise. And as the fear of crime rises, you see greater negative attitudes, not just towards the RCMP, but police in general.
With that conversation of Black Lives Matter and the idea of defund the police, to that point you made about the thin blue line, where it could be perhaps excused as or explained as solidarity for the people who put their lives on the line. There's evidence of that clearly in Canada, with 2 officers dying on the line of duty last week. But that perhaps co-opting of some of this, and you did a great job of explaining what the evolution was of that terminology of the thin blue line. But does it get complicated? Is this, in your opinion, the result of groups becoming so polarized that it's nearly the example is Halifax police engaged with a stolen truck. It went through a residential neighborhood. It drove across lawns, and people are going, what are you doing? But on the other hand, they're being criticized for not doing anything in other cases. So it's a real strange time.
Yeah, and certainly, one of the other issues driving sort of negative perceptions of police is just ongoing media coverage and incidents of police brutality against people of color, of Indigenous people. The RCMP has long been accused of being racist, quite frankly, towards Indigenous people, and again, not just the RCMP, but other police forces that have to police Indigenous populations. And of course, as you mentioned, we've seen a number of news stories about police officers wearing that thin blue line patch, which certainly doesn't help with perceptions of impartiality among police, because as you intimated, that thin blue line patch has taken on some racist overtones, and the big fear we have is the radicalization of police officers, and this is the bigger issue of the great threat of radicalization of young white men. We're seeing this in the United States, we're seeing this in Canada with the trucker convoy, and the argument is in recent years that the thin blue line patch has been sort of co-opted by radical far-right groups in response to the emergence of progressive groups like Black Lives Matters or Defund Police that are seen as a threat to police. But the great fear we have is that with this concerted effort to radicalize young white men, to what extent does that reach into police community, policing circles? And to what extent are police officers becoming radicalized? And that's, obviously has significant implications for policing, not just of racialized communities, but the policing of far-right groups themselves.
And so much of what this discourse is it is polarized. It's angry. It's, police need to get less money, or some people were worried that all that's going to come of the mass casualty inquiry will be more calls for more police resources, that's what's going to be result from that. But as you point out, the trust or faith in institutions is waning, and there's a lot of concern over the mass casualty commission's outcome. What really what impact are they going to have, and will that change anything? I don't know if you've noticed, but the union representing RCMP officers has been very much trying to drum up public support by sponsoring ads on social media, trying to get people to engage, trying to show a different narrative. Do you think people are buying that? That it's a fringe element, it's a co-opted movement, that by and large police officers are good people?
I certainly would say so. I mean, I'm not anti-police. I'm very much pro-police. I've been working with police for 30 years or so, from municipal all the way up to federal policing. Yeah, it's that's that question that it's so difficult to answer. Let's say when you talk about racism or white supremacy, are we talking about institutionalized racism where prejudice and bigotry are embedded in the actual infrastructure or institution, whether it's policing or healthcare or the economy, or are we just talking about a few bad apples? With respect to the thin blue line, I think it's a microcosm of that debate, because on the one hand, you have police forces saying, well, this is just a few of our members, not necessarily bad apples, but most police forces have prohibited the wearing of this patch. But at the same time, within police unions, they actually have defended the wearing of this patch. So in Calgary, when the police board basically told the police union and the Calgary Police Force not to wear this patch, they got a lot of pushback from the police union. And they even tried to, and so there was a compromise. I think the compromise would they would wrap a blue ribbon around the door of some of the district offices of Calgary Police, but there was a real pushback. And the same with the RCMP, the national organization that represents RCMP members, also articulated some pushback against the directive to ban that patch. So I mean, the unions are there to protect their members. That's their number one job. I'm not sure why they would want to, fight against a patch that has such negative connotations. But, we have racism that's, again, institutionalized in many of our dominant institutions. Like I said, healthcare. We saw that with COVID, where racialized communities died at a far higher rate. We see it in our education system, our labor market. But obviously, it's when it's in policing, when you have racism in policing, whether it's institutionalized or just a few bad apples, it obviously has even more significant repercussions. But again, I'm a believer that racism is historically institutionalized in many of these dominant institutions in our society. But it's not necessarily the fault of the chief of police or the RCMP commissioner or individual members. It's, again, just something that historical, and it's very difficult to exercise that belief system from these institutions that have been in there for so long, like, over 100 years in many cases.
And we talk about perspective. If you happen to live in downtown Ottawa during the protests, I'm sure you have a different view than if you were someone who supported them, saying they were there to fight against using peaceful protest measures that were considered discriminatory. And the perspective about the crime rate over the last 5 years, Angus Reid says, do you feel that it's on the increase or the decrease? 60% said no. It looks like it's getting higher, but is it really getting higher? As we both discussed in the past, sometimes your individual perception may be influenced by what's happening in your neighborhood, even though something may not be happening to you. I guess, long story short, that whole piece was about lack of trust, or an erosion of the trust in the foundations. How do you counter that as a society? How do we overcome that perception through media and others that it's worse than it has ever been, when maybe that data is not reflected in the actual data?
Well, certainly we've seen crime rate gone up, but really marginally, I would say. And keep in mind, too, that in the last few years, we've had historically low crime rates, historically low violent crime rates. And that's primarily because, the baby boomers are entering their senior years, and crime rate is often driven by demographic factors. In this case, the baby boomers were in their crime-prone years during the 60s and 70s and 80s, when the crime rate that drove the increase in crime rate. As they became older, and entered their sort of middle age and senior years, they were less involved in crime. Now we're seeing the millennial generation, which is a pretty big cohort. They're sort of entering their crime-prone years. But really, we haven't seen any significant increases in crime, relative to the way it was in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And Canadians in many ways should be lucky, because you look at the United States right now, and their crime rate, especially violent crime rate, is increasing at a far greater clip than Canada. And usually that's not the case. Because of demographics, they usually tend to sort of parallel one another, but we're seeing far greater increases in the crime rate in the United States. So in many ways relative, but we still get news from the US. And so that really influences our perceptions. And even just watching all the, Netflix and Prime have just this plethora of cops and robber shows now. We have all these true crime podcasts, and so crime is always this fascination to people. And the more we hear about and read about it, the more afraid we tend to be, especially if we were a senior. As far as addressing the latter half of your question, there's definite ways to counter this barrage of news about crime, and a lot of it comes down to just community policing, and that's the ability of police to get out there and not necessarily issue press releases, but get into the community and face-to-face meetings with populations that tend to have a perception of higher crime rates, whether that's a senior community, whether that's racialized communities, Indigenous communities. So one of the tenets of crime prevention and community policing is not just to address crime, but it's to address disorder problems and fear of crime, because fear of crime can be as debilitating, if not even more debilitating than crime, because when you are fearful of crime, you don't engage in society, you sort of lock your doors and withdraw from society. And for truly sort of vibrant, functioning, crime-free societies, you need people out on the streets and out using public spaces and basically taking a stand against offenders. So it is really important that police and others counter perceptions of a rise in crime rate and fear of crime. And it's a really important part of addressing crime, addressing fear of crime, but also the broader goal of, well-functioning, vibrant, safe, secure communities.
And before I go, 4 years since the legalization of cannabis in Canada. That anniversary date is today. Any thoughts on the success in the implementation, the rollout, and where we're at 4 years in?
Well, it's interesting because it's almost like a non-news story. There's all this talk about legalization in the U.S. and other countries, and if you look at Canada, it's been like a nothing burger. Really, it's just people are now just accepted as a part of our society. As far as the goal, one of the goals that the Liberal government had in legalizing marijuana to address illegal supply, black markets, the involvement in organized crime, it's been a complete bust. Basically, we've seen really no evidence that the bad guys, well-organized growers and wholesalers and exporters, have actually gotten out of the business. In fact, retailers and wholesalers are adapting to legalization by building more potent products, higher THC levels in black market pot, lower prices, edibles that you can get in the black market that you can't get in the legal market. We've seen significant exports continue in the United States. In fact, exports, you can say, have increased, although we don't have any hard data on that, because the U.S. Is still a big market for Canadian pot. We've seen these bad guys still infiltrate the legal industry, the medical marijuana industry. So it's really significant, Sheldon, because we have very few research and case studies on the impact of legalization on organized crime. And so here is an interesting case study. And I've been contacted by some RCMP members and others in BC about the legalization of possession of hard drugs like heroin, and they asked me, what do you think the implications of that for organized crime and black markets? And I said, well, if you look at marijuana, it's not going to have that big of impact. And so, if this was sort of the one last optimistic, policy I thought could actually address black markets and organized crime, was legalization. And now even that we're seeing is not a fruitful effort. So I've reached this sort of completely nihilistic perspective on what we can do about black markets and organized crime. But it's one of the great challenges addressing our society. I mean, the introduction of fentanyl alone as a black market, street drug, has changed everything as far as organized crime and drug enforcement. And, we're at a real crossroads in how to address drug trafficking, overdoses, and the involvement of organized crime in that particular black market.
As always, appreciate your perspective. Stephen Schneider, a criminology professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax. A lot of ground we covered. Thank you for this today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sheldon. Have a good day.